You said Jeffrey Epstein committed suicide. People don't believe it. That was the question. That was the moment. And somehow, it was also the beginning of something far louder than words. The frame is tight, too tight. Fox News never intended for this moment to breathe. Kash Patel shifts his weight. The interviewer leans forward just slightly, and then it lands. That fractional crooked lift of the mouth that mimics a smile, but means something colder. A laugh. Yes, but sharpened into a shape that fits comfortably between contempt and evasion. He laughs, not nervously, not joyfully, but with a confidence born of systems that clean up the mess behind people like him. To his right, Dan Bongino sits with the stillness of a man rehearsing steadiness. His jaw firms, his lips draw to the left, an involuntary gesture made not out of emotion, but resistance. His eyes search somewhere just above the camera, perhaps out of habit, perhaps out of instinct, avoiding the gaze that might catch too much. The moment is brief, but it doesn't dissolve. It multiplies. A Twitter user isolates the clip. 32 seconds of television, but the internet breathes life into it. Slowed down, looped, replayed with ticking clocks and closed captions. The laughter becomes heavier. The silence afterward more suspicious. By the time it passes 500,000 views, it's no longer a segment. It's evidence. At the edge of the city, in a room washed amber by the dusk and dimmed further by a flickering desk lamp, older than most cable networks, Dr. Gabor Mate watches. He has watched it before, and yet he rewinds. This time, he watches without blinking. This time, he listens not to the words, but to what seeps out beneath them. The constriction of throat, the pacing of breath, the disconnect between the spine and the script. The moment Kash Patel chuckles, Dr. Mate leans forward slightly, as if to receive a confession no one else recognizes as one. He watches down Bongino, not speaking, not nodding, not affirming, simply recalibrating his posture, his chin shifting as if his body were saying something his mouth refuses to utter. The body never lies. It speaks often when speech becomes too expensive. A notification buzzes on his phone. A producer he once advised during a documentary on trauma and institutional silence sends only one line: "We're live Thursday." That laugh is all over Twitter. "We need you to break it open." He doesn't reply. Not immediately. Instead, he plays the clip once more, this time with sound muted. He watches Patel's shoulders, Bongino's jawline, the pause that follows the laughter. Not a pause of reflection, but of calculation. He knows that rhythm. It's the rhythm of men who understand that truth has a half-life. And if you smirk long enough, it might decay before anyone dares exhume it. Another ping, a follow-up. We're calling the segment the laugh that broke the silence. You in? This time, Dr. Mate types only 3 words: roll the tape. He stands slowly and closes the laptop. Behind him, the screen freezes on Patel's face. The laugh, looped in silence, lingers. No longer a sound, but a stain. The green room was cold, not because the air conditioning was set too low, but because truth in places like this rarely walks in with warmth. The lights behind the curtain flickered like a heartbeat, struggling to hold tempo. Dr. Gabor Mate stood by the corner table, quietly pouring hot water over a sachet of peppermint tea. His hand was steady, his breath slow. He had been in operating rooms of grief before, but this one wore makeup and a multi-camera rig. A young assistant with a clipboard and the posture of a PR school graduate hovered nearby. "Mr. Mate," she said, hesitating only slightly before correcting herself. "Doctor, just a heads up. They're going to hit hard right from the top." Patel plans to lead with the eye was their defense, and Bona will follow with a file-thumping monologue. They'll try to drown you in confidence. He stirred the tea once. Confidence doesn't hold up well when the body speaks differently. A cameraman, gray cap, sunken eyes, nerves worn to transparency, walked in holding a monitor. "You might want to see this," he said, and pulled up a clip labeled Fox Raw, internal cut. On screen, Patel laughed just like before. But this time, the segment didn't end there. Bongino, arms folded tight across his chest, leaned forward and muttered something inaudible. The camera panned for a second, caught his lips pressing together, his right eye twitching once. Then the words surfaced through the mic. It's not like he was murdered. That would imply somebody gave a damn. The cameraman exhaled like he'd been holding it for days. Fox cut that entire line. Didn't even make it to B-roll. Dr. Mate leaned in, nodding, not in surprise, but in confirmation. They didn't cut it because it was false. They cut it because it was too honest to survive that studio. The producer of the segment, a woman in her 40s with eyes like she hadn't blinked in 6 years, stepped into the room. "Doctor, you got 5 minutes. Just a reminder, no monologues. Keep it tight." Split screen starts live. Mate replied without looking at her. "You brought me here to speak in seconds about what took years to bury. I'll speak tight, but I won't speak shallow." She opened her mouth to reply, but thought better of it. From the hallway, the host's voice echoed. Rehearsed, charismatic, just disarming enough to mask the fact that this was, at its core, an ambush. "This is not a courtroom," the assistant offered. Mate adjusted his sleeves. "And yet everyone's trying to walk out acquitted." He took a sip of the tea. The cup didn't rattle. He had spent enough time with dying addicts, abused children, and abandoned veterans to recognize a different kind of decay, the kind that wears ties and hides behind laugh tracks. The cameraman spoke again, more to himself than anyone else. "They keep saying it's just a segment, just TV, but people are watching this stuff between bills and bedtime. If the lie lands smoother, they'll sleep through the truth." Mate set the cup down, steady and exact. That's why silence has better ratings than noise. It doesn't interrupt. There was a pause, not empty but thick. The makeup girl entered with a brush, but he waved her off politely. "Don't cover the lines. They earn their place." She nodded and stepped back. The producer's voice crackled over the intercom. "Stage in 30, split feed in 10. The MC leaned into the room from the hallway. "Dr. Mate," he said with that carefully sharpened baritone, "you don't have to win tonight. You just have to make them uncomfortable enough to remember." Mate glanced up. His voice didn't rise, but it settled deep. "I've spent 20 years walking people back from the edge. But none of them had security detail, lawyers, or PR crisis firms. They just had pain and no place for it to go." He paused, then added, "If Patel and Bino truly understand suicide, I'd love to ask them what it smells like after 3 days." When nobody came, no one replied. A light above the door switched from red to blue. It was time. The light shifted and the screen divided. A split feed. On the left, Cash Patel and Dan Bongino seated in front of a lacquered desk and patriotic backdrop. On the right, Dr. Gabor, Mate stood framed in a cooler palette, his expression unreadable, his posture relaxed like someone who'd already survived worse than cameras. The host wasted no time. Tonight on State of Mind, we asked the question the nation's been whispering since 2019. Did Jeffrey Epstein kill himself? Patel leaned into his mic like a man gearing up for a fistfight disguised as an interview. "I worked inside those prisons. I've been in the segregation units. I've walked the yards. I've seen suicides with my own eyes. And I can tell you straight, this was one. He killed himself. Period." Bongino nodded with that familiar rhythm. Firm, practiced, like a preacher who didn't need to convince the converted. "I've seen the file front to back. There's no conspiracy here. The case is closed." The host turned to Dr. Mate, who said nothing for a full 5 seconds. Silence stretched like a tight wire across the studio. He didn't blink. His gaze drifted, not to the other guests, but straight into the lens, as if bypassing the stage and speaking directly to the living rooms watching at home. "The case may be closed," he said slowly, "but your bodies are still speaking." A flicker of confusion crossed Patel's brow. Bongino straightened, lips parting to interrupt. Mate continued, calm as a confession. "In my field, we study trauma not by what is said, but by what the body reveals when the mouth goes off script." The host gestured toward the control booth. "We have that clip from the Fox interview. Let's roll it back." Slow motion. Pause on Patel's reaction. The footage played across the screen, Patel's smirk, the eye movement, the tight shoulder draw. Then Bonino's posture, arms crossed, lips pulling left, chin twitching. Mate leaned forward slightly. "Right there. That's the moment the script failed." Patel chuckled, but it landed flat. "So now we're diagnosing people from body language?" Is this a talk show or a seance? The audience tittered, more uneasy than amused. I don't diagnose, Mate replied, voice steady. I observe patterns. I listen for what escapes the rehearsed defense. You laughed at the mention of Epstein's suicide. And you, he turned slightly to Bonino, couldn't keep your mouth closed or your body still when you said the case was settled. Bonino jumped in. You're twisting this. You think that because we didn't react like grieving mothers, we're hiding something? Mate nodded, not in agreement, but as if acknowledging a pattern unfolding exactly as expected. You reacted as men protecting a narrative, not as citizens disturbed by the death of a man tied to power, money, and underage girls. There's a difference. Patel's tone sharpened. I gave facts. I've been in the system. What's your resume? Sitting in a circle with people crying over childhood stories. Mate's eyes narrowed, just a fraction. My resume includes listening to victims you would rather not name. It includes recognizing when the truth has been buried, not for lack of evidence, but for surplus of access. The host interjected, let's stay on track. Dan, you mentioned seeing the file. Bongino straightened again. I've seen the whole thing. The photos, the reports, the logs. Look, I used to be a cop. I know what suicide scenes look like. This was clean. Mate tilted his head. Clean is an interesting word for a cell with broken bones, corrupted footage, and falsified logs. The host raised a brow. Doctor, are you suggesting? I'm suggesting, Mate said, that when 2 guards fall asleep, 2 cameras fail, and a high-profile prisoner ends up with injuries more consistent with strangulation than hanging, it warrants more than a chuckle and a shrug. A murmur swept through the audience. Patel leaned in again, voice louder now. That's speculation, not science. It's pattern recognition, Mate replied. And science begins where silence ends. The host looked between them. Gentlemen, let me ask this, Mate said, still steady. Have either of you ever sat with a person who attempted suicide and lived to describe the moment they let go? Have you watched their hands shake, remembering how alone they felt? Have you walked into a room after 3 days and smelled what was left behind? The studio stilled. Bongino glanced away. Patel adjusted his collar. Mate folded his hands. If you have and still laughed, then perhaps you weren't in that prison to protect justice. Perhaps you were there to keep the cameras from recording what justice looked like. The screen faded to a commercial, but the silence it left behind didn't fade. The studio dimmed to a colder hue, the kind that made faces look sharper, movements more exposed. The host gestured toward the screen behind them, and the freeze frame of Cash Patel's half-smile appeared in high definition, zoomed, slowed, and unforgiving. Dr. Gabor, Mate sat still, but his voice carried forward like a scalpel across soft tissue. Let's focus here, he said, pointing to the slight asymmetry at the corner of Patel's mouth. That right there isn't composure. That's restraint dressed up as confidence. That's a man trying to smother a reflex. The audience hushed. The image paused mid-expression. Patel's smile, once so casual in real time, now looked rehearsed under dissection. That's just your opinion. Bongino cut in, voice tense, the edges clipped too neatly. Mate turned to him slowly. As a trauma specialist, I don't deal in opinions. I observe what seeps through when language can't hold the weight. I read what escapes when your words fail. You weren't defending a conclusion. You were surviving a question. Patel leaned forward, tension collecting in his jawline, now visible under the lights. So, what are you saying, doctor? That I'm lying. Mate's voice didn't rise, but it deepened. I'm saying your nervous system answered before your mouth did. The audience reaction was a ripple. Some gasped, others stifled grin. Even the host blinked, recalibrating the gravity of the room. Facial muscles contract before the brain chooses a sentence. Mate continued, tapping his temple lightly. You smiled at the idea of Epstein's suicide, the same way someone smiles in traffic court. Like it's a script they didn't write, but have to deliver. Patel scoffed, adjusting his microphone. So now I'm being psychoanalyzed because I didn't cry on cue. You're not being analyzed, Mate replied. You're being listened to more carefully than you've been trained to expect. Bongino shifted slightly, his gaze fixed on a point far off stage. Let's go back to the eyes, Mate added. You looked down, not toward reflection, but toward avoidance. And when Dan crossed his arms, it wasn't grounding, it was containment. Bongino muttered, "This is theater." "No," Mate answered, calm and lethal. "Theater rehearses until the lie looks real. What you gave us was raw, and the body, unlike your narrative, doesn't rehearse." Patel's voice grew louder, searching for anchors. "I'm not a nervous man. I've testified before Congress, briefed presidents, run intelligence teams. And yet," Mate said, still fixed on the image behind them, "your body trembled at a basic question. Did Jeffrey Epstein kill himself?" The host interjected, "Doctor, some would say this is speculative. And some would say silence is clarity." Mate replied without blinking. "But when every camera turns away and every file loses a page, I turn to what cannot be edited." The screen behind them shifted again. Patel smiled. Bonino's lip twitch, looped twice in quiet. "You're watching defense mechanisms," Mate said. "You're watching two men who mastered policy briefs and Sunday sound bites suddenly interrupted by their own truth." Patel attempted a laugh. "It's amazing how far a PhD can stretch. You should open a circus." "I prefer funerals," Mate said without blinking. "They tend to be more honest." The crowd hushed again, and the screen lingered, still playing the laugh. That wry, weak moment of something too human for spin. The screen behind them flickered, then dissolved into grayscale. No blood, no gore, just outlines, clinical, cold, undeniable. A body diagram rotated slowly on screen, labels fading in like indictments whispered under breath. Hyoid fracture, hemorrhage capillaries, ligature pattern inconsistent with low drop. Dr. Gabor, Mate adjusted his microphone, his tone calm, but sharpened like a scalpel freshly honed. "Let's abandon theory for a moment and return to evidence. These aren't speculations. These are items in the official file. The one Mr. Bongino claims to have read cover to cover." The host stayed silent. Mate's voice deepened. "Cellmate removed. Guards asleep. Records falsified. Cameras failed. Body moved. Bones broken. Lips split. Capillaries burst." Each word landed like a gavel. "Dan, you mentioned this was a clean scene. I'd like to understand how clean now includes compromised footage in a corpse with injuries typically seen in manual strangulation." Bongino shifted. His mouth opened, but only one phrase found its way out. "That happens in prison." Mate turned to him, his stare neither angry nor surprised, just precise. "Then may I ask, how many of those deaths required two malfunctioning cameras, forged logs, and a corpse photographed only after it had been relocated?" A breath caught somewhere in the audience. The host straightened in his chair as if his spine were catching up to the moment. Bongino's voice cracked again. "Look, I'm just saying prisons are chaotic. People make mistakes. Epstein was under pressure. He broke." Mate raised an eyebrow. "He broke. So did the cameras. So did the logs. So did the hyoid bone." Laughter, tight, involuntary, escaped from somewhere in the audience. Then quiet again, the kind that follows unease, not comfort. Patel leaned forward, deflecting. "Doctor, let's be honest. He was a coward. He knew what was coming and opted out. This is sensationalism, not psychiatry." Mate met his eyes. Cowardice doesn't snap the neck like a garrote, and psychiatry begins with patterns. Yours are oddly aligned with redactions. Patel smirked. "You get this passionate about every rich pedophile who dies, or just the ones connected to Democrats." Mate's reply came without pause. "I get this passionate when a human corpse tells a story louder than 3 press releases in a media blackout." The host tried to pivot. "Let's just clarify. Doctor, are you suggesting foul play?" "I'm suggesting the evidence resisted silence," Mate replied. "And your response to that resistance was to minimize it, which tells me either you're overwhelmed by coincidence or you're too close to comfort." Bongino's voice pitched upward. "You're painting a conspiracy with no names, no killer, no motive, just mood lighting and smirks. That's not evidence." "Neither is denial," Mate responded, "but it remains your preferred strategy." He turned back to the screen. "The hyoid bone fractures in 3 places. A single drop hanging suicide typically breaks it once. Manual strangulation often breaks it twice or more. Epstein's broke 3. He paused, letting the number hang. Now tell me, Dan, do you remember seeing that in your file? Bongino stared ahead, silent. Mate continued, measured, unhurried. Broken bones speak. So do burst vessels. So do destroyed logs and dead cameras. If your defense is that chaos just happens, then let me ask, how often does chaos edit itself clean? No one answered, and in that moment, even silence surrendered. The lights above the studio softened to an amber haze, no longer interrogative, but mournful. The tempo of the room shifted. The audience, once eager for conflict, now held its collective breath like spectators at a funeral where the eulogy dared to name the killer. Dr. Gabor, Mate sat motionless. His voice, however, moved like a slow flame across the set. This is no longer about Jeffrey Epstein, he said. He's dead, and whatever truth he carried in his hands has been buried with him. He paused, not for effect, but as if offering space to a truth too large to be spoken all at once. What we've seen here tonight is about a system designed to ensure that when a body dies, the truth dies with it. And some of you helped build that system. A camera panned across the table. Dan Bongino stared down, no longer speaking, his arms once crossed, now resting limp on the desk. Patel sat rigid, lips tight, not from restraint, but from loss, of ground, of narrative, of something harder to name. The host, eager to wrest back the script, leaned forward. Well, thank you all for... Mate raised a hand. Not forcefully, just firmly enough to hold the silence in place. You brought me here to read body language, he said, but what I see is spiritual rigor mortis. The room froze, he continued. It starts when institutions treat evidence like embarrassment. When files are edited by the same hands that write press releases. When justice is choreographed like a halftime show and truth becomes a liability instead of a destination. His words didn't rise in volume, but in clarity, like the edge of a blade sharpened by restraint. You asked if Epstein killed himself, but no one here asked how many voices died before his. How many whistleblowers disappeared? How many survivors were told their silence was patriotic? The audience had stopped reacting. They were no longer watching a debate. They were witnessing something else entirely, something their favorite news segment could not digest. Mate stood now not to leave, but to close the loop. This isn't about Epstein's neck, he said. It's about how quickly the world learned to look away. It's about a man who died in a room filled with failed cameras, sleeping guards, erased logs, and yet we're still told to trust the paperwork. He turned to the camera straight, unblinking. The more you deny a story, the more it grows in the dark. The more you mock those who question, the louder the questions become. And tonight, those questions weren't answered. They were buried again, just with better lighting. The host finally managed to find a line. Well, Doctor, we appreciate your perspective as always. Passionate. Mate didn't smile. Passion doesn't bury bones. Power does. The lights dimmed. The outro music played soft, sterile. A technician leaned back and whispered he didn't raise his voice once. Another replied he didn't have to. He just let the facts breathe, and they suffocated everyone else. Outside, the night bled into the streets of D.C., and the first wave of tweets began to ripple across the digital skyline. May just performed an autopsy on American hypocrisy live. Bongino blinked. Patel broke. May didn't flinch. They said it was suicide, but we just watched something else. Clips were trimmed, looped, and captioned within minutes. Hashtags rose like steam from pavement still hot with denial. Epstein files. Trump knew. Body doesn't lie. Mate knew. In a bar 2 blocks from the studio, a woman in a denim jacket sipped her drink without turning from the screen. She whispered to the man beside her. He didn't shout. He just made them stop breathing. A news anchor tried to spin the segment as controversial but inconclusive. His smile cracked on air. Fox reran the episode with tighter edits. CNN scheduled a panel. MSNBC clipped the spiritual rigor mortis line and turned it into a Chiron headline. But the truth had already left the building, unfiltered, uncut, and re-uploaded by millions. Backstage, Dr. Mate walked past the catering table, past the crew wrapping wires, past the empty makeup chair. He didn't need a word. The silence trailed behind him like a verdict. A stagehand offered a nod. That was enough. In a hallway mirror, his reflection held the same stillness he carried into the segment. Not anger, not triumph, just gravity. And on a screen inside a teenager's bedroom in Ohio, on a cracked phone in a laundromat in Baltimore, on a flat screen in Union Hall in Milwaukee, the final frame appeared again. Jeffrey Epstein's case is closed, but the cover-up continues, in body, in silence, in broadcast.